She was surrounded by people, but she seemed to only listen to him. Not because he was the most handsome, or the funniest, or the most talkative. In fact, he spoke little. But every time he opened his mouth, the world around him seemed to slow down. It was as if his words carried a weight that bent the air, a kind of magnetism that came not from what he said, but from how he made people feel while saying it. And herein lies the brutal contradiction. Most people try to seem interesting, while true seducers make others feel special. This is the secret that almost no one teaches, because almost no one understands. We live in an age where everyone wants to be heard, but few know how to listen. Where everyone seeks to be noticed, but no one knows how to be remembered. It is in this social noise that the true art of seductive conversation is lost. It's not about catchphrases or fancy persuasion techniques. The game is in the subtext, and the most powerful subtext is the one that silently says, "I see you, and I don't need you." This is the most lethal combination of verbal attraction, presence, and detachment. Nietzsche said that, "What is done out of love is always beyond good and evil. But what is done out of insecurity always falls flat," and words betray this long before body language. Science has proven that in less than 7 seconds, we form an almost irreversible impression of someone, and that 93% of human communication doesn't depend on word choice, but on the tone, rhythm, and internal state of the speaker. But why then do we continue to try to impress with phrases, stories, or curious facts, when what truly creates attraction is atmosphere? Because we've been programmed to think that information generates connection. But the truth is different. Connection isn't born from content. Connection is born from shared emotional context. You can have the best argument in the world. If the energy of the conversation is off, it's worthless. On the other hand, a simple phrase said in the right tone, at the right time, with the right intention, can make someone fall in love without realizing it. And that's why in this video, we'll delve deeper into the triad that transforms any conversation into an invisible magnetic field. 3 levels that evolve from shallow to deep, creating a psychological ladder where each rung increases tension, interest, and the desire to continue. The first, strategic superficial connection, teaches you how to open light conversations without seeming desperate. The second, subtle value escalation, reveals how to establish social proof and microdominance without seeming arrogant. And the third, emotional mirroring, activates a silent "we" code that triggers bonds of emotional identification that are almost impossible to undo. But before delving into these pillars, you need to understand something that forever transforms the way you communicate. Every conversation is a negotiation of status. And those who surrender control of the conversation too early, whether by talking too much, seeking validation, or trying to please, have already lost before they begin. Attraction is born in mystery, in comfortable silence, in the absence of rush, in the space where the other begins to want to fill the void with interest. And this space needs to be crafted, like a good movie script. The best lines are those that seem spontaneous, but are constructed with surgical precision to seem natural. Seduction isn't falsehood, it's direction. It's knowing where you want to go and guiding the other person there without them noticing. The ancients already knew this. Ovid, in his classic The Art of Loving, said that technique can control love. That being desired isn't an accident, but a consequence. Ortega y Gasset asserted that love is surrender through fascination. And fascination, as all the great masters knew, isn't a bolt from the blue. It's a frequency, a field, an internal state you radiate when you know you don't need to prove anything. Just provoke sensations. And to do that, you need to stop asking yourself, "What do I say now?" and start asking yourself, "What is she feeling now?" That's the shift, that's the leap. Over the next few minutes, you'll understand how to activate this triad of verbal attraction. Not as a cheap manipulator, but as an emotional strategist, as someone who knows the game inside out and plays better because they feel more. Every word, every pause, every look will be a weapon, but not to dominate, to reveal what has always been there. The silent power of those who master their own presence. The biggest mistake anyone can make when trying to be interesting is trying too hard. There's something desperate about entering a conversation, eager to prove their worth. And the curious thing is that the more effort they put into it, the more artificial everything seems. The tone rises a little too high. The words come a little too quickly. Laughter comes before the joke. Eyes seek validation in the eyes of others with each sentence thrown out, as if to say, "Will you accept me now?" And that's when everything falls apart. Because, as Pascal said, those who want to appear intelligent are the least intelligent. The same goes for charm. It doesn't declare itself, it manifests itself in the absence of need. Strategic superficial connection begins where neediness ends. It's the subtle mastery of knowing how to initiate a light, almost banal interaction, but without seeming as if your self-esteem depends on the continuation of that exchange. Imagine conversation as a game of emotional chess. Your first move isn't to win, it's to test the other person's response, and more importantly, to observe. Great seducers talk less than they observe. They're always attentive to the micro-behaviors, the body language of those they're listening to. They know that the most valuable response comes not from the mouth, but from the eyes. A slight sparkle, an involuntary smile, a leaning in. These are the true invitations, and those who don't notice them force doors that weren't open. Starting conversations lightly is an art, and this art begins with eliminating anxiety about results. The truth is, the most attractive people aren't trying to impress, they're having fun. There's a quiet pleasure in simply being there, present, without a script. This is disconcerting, because it's common to see people trying to perform. And performing is always tiring. Verbal seduction begins with something that seems banal, the confidence to take your time, to not demand a reaction, to throw a phrase into the air, a casual observation, an unexpected comment, an absurd question, and expect nothing more than your own amusement. Like a magician performing a trick but not caring whether the audience understands. He knows that those who have eyes will see. Humor is one of the most powerful weapons at this level. But not just any humor. Not the kind that tries to be a clown, that screams to get attention. Seductive humor comes from a safe place. It's the humor that laughs at one's own misfortune with elegance, that makes absurd comments about trivial situations, that observes the world with a slightly askew eye, as if living in a parallel universe and inviting others to visit this curious place for a few seconds. It's well-calibrated self-irony, the ability to laugh at oneself without seeming defeated. The secret is that this kind of humor doesn't ask for laughter, it offers complicity. And complicity is the first sign of well-planted seduction. And here comes one of the greatest social paradoxes. The less you try to generate connection, the more it happens. This isn't mysticism. It's behavioral psychology. Studies show that when someone realizes you're comfortable with yourself, they tend to relax too. Their defenses lower. The conversation flows. And the mind, which was previously calibrated to identify social threats, rejection, judgment, discomfort, enters a state of associative pleasure. In other words, you become a pleasant environment. And whoever is a pleasant environment is always invited back. But if subtle humor and a light presence are the soil, what do you plant in that soil? How do you choose the right words for an initial connection that doesn't sound rehearsed or needy? The answer lies in the technique of situational observation. Everything around you is material. The place, the people, the weather, the music. Any element can become a gateway to a conversation that feels spontaneous. And this is where you need to think like a comedian or a social detective. The best comedians are keen observers of reality. They point out the obvious in non-obvious ways. The best seducers do the same. They transform the ordinary into the enchanting with just a verbal twist, a shift in perspective, a provocative question in a light tone. For example, in a bar line, instead of asking, "Do you come here often?" which betrays an attempt at approach, you could comment, "This line makes me feel like I'm about to buy a ticket to see a miracle happen in there." The phrase has light humor, a hint of exaggeration, and invites engagement without seeming like an invitation. If the response is neutral, you smile and return to yourself, without insistence, without need. Because what you plant isn't the phrase, it's the feeling that you're someone who observes the world with interesting eyes. And this, little by little, places you in a special place in the other person's mind. Another key point of this phase is controlling your verbal energy. Speaking less is more. But it's not just speaking fewer words, it's speaking with more pause, more intention, more silence between one sentence and the next. Silence, used well, is the cigarette of seduction. It leaves the other person eager for more, without knowing why. Most people hate silence in conversation because they feel it's a sign of rejection, but when you master it, it transforms into power. You say a light phrase, smile, and fall silent. Let the other person search for the next word, and when they do, they're already engaged. From then on, you have the chance to create rhythm, and rhythm is what drives the dance of interaction. And perhaps the most overlooked point by those who want to become attractive in a conversation is here. Knowing when not to engage. Not every presence needs to turn into a conversation. Sometimes the greatest charm lies in seeming unapproachable, in leaving a trail of curiosity in the air, in being the one who could have spoken but didn't. Because controlled silence in a social setting is an anomaly. And the human brain pays attention to anomalies. It tries to decipher. It projects. And projection is always more powerful than any presentation. The big problem is that most people start with the end in mind. They want to make a good impression. They want to keep the conversation flowing. They want to secure the number, the interest, the next date. But those who start out fixated on the outcome have already lost the game. A true emotional strategist understands that every interaction is a testing ground, that you're not trying to win the other person over. You're testing whether they deserve access to your reality. This mindset changes everything. Your language changes, your gaze changes, your posture changes. You don't pursue, you invite, and invitations can be ignored, but not forgotten. There's a silent mistake that drives people away more than it brings them closer, showing too much value too soon. It's almost a curse of the insecure, the rush to convince the other person that you're worth it, to show that you have a good job, that you're intelligent, well-traveled, that you've read difficult books, and that you know sophisticated references. But the effect is always the opposite. The more someone tries to demonstrate value directly, the more the other person feels like they're being sold. And when something is for sale, desire disappears. True value never needs to be explained. It insinuates itself. It leaves clues. It leaves questions hanging. High-level seduction is subtle. It's almost invisible. It reveals itself gradually, as if the other person is discovering a secret. And the human brain loves secrets. Cognitive psychology studies show that dopamine, the neurotransmitter of pleasure and motivation, is activated more by anticipation than by the reward itself. In other words, people are more attracted to mystery than to revelation. And that's why escalation of value needs to be progressive, elegant, almost accidental. A loose comment. A story that reveals without seeming to be told with that intention. An attitude that demonstrates dominance without needing to assert superiority. The first rule of this escalation is the reversal of intention. Instead of trying to prove your worth, make the other person want to discover it. And this starts with controlling your own frame. In any conversation, multiple frames compete for space: authority, curiosity, judgment, lightness, and tension. Whoever imposes their frame first usually dominates the dynamic. And the most powerful frame in the escalation of value is that of non-need. When you convey, verbally and non-verbally, that you are there for pleasure, not to seek it, the other person begins to wonder what it is about you that makes you so confident, so present, so uninterested in other people's validation. And this question is the seed of implicit value. Implicit value is what you let the other person imagine. And imagining is always more powerful than knowing. When you say, "I'm an entrepreneur," you satisfy their curiosity. When you say, "Sometimes I have to deal with difficult people who cost me my freedom," you evoke an image. When you say, "I lived abroad for a while," you sound ordinary. When you say, "I always find it curious how quiet the cafes here are, different from where I lived before," you activate the imagination. The difference is in the detail, in the suggestion, in the subtext. And this is where so-called camouflaged social proof comes in. The human social brain responds strongly to indirect validation. When you tell a story that involves other people reacting positively to you or recognizing you for some skill, without forcing this information, the value is absorbed without resistance. For example, when you tell that a friend invited you to help them with a project because they needed someone they could trust, you don't say you're trustworthy, you demonstrate it. If you mention that an ex once complained that you interact too much with women, you're not showing off. You're implying that you're desired. The key is the focus of the story. It's never about you. It's about the other person, but it reveals you. This creates identification, lightness, and curiosity. Another crucial element in escalating value is subtle microdominance. It's the kind of authority that doesn't attack, but asserts itself naturally. This begins with body language. A relaxed posture, open shoulders, and calm, slow gestures convey control. A direct gaze, without anxious averting, signals confidence. And in words, microdominance appears in the small details. Not interrupting to agree, using pauses instead of filling in excuses, charmingly declining invitations, not today, but try again next week, or even lightly teasing. That theory of yours is dangerous, I like that. These are ways of positioning yourself as someone who sets the pace, and whoever sets the pace, sets the narrative. Tone of voice is also a decisive instrument here. Speaking slower than average with emphasis on certain words creates a hypnotic atmosphere. But the secret is in variation. Sometimes a strategic pause is worth more than 1,000 arguments. People who constantly talk at a fast pace, trying to occupy every inch of space, convey anxiety. People who control the pace of the conversation, like a conductor, create tension. And tension is the prelude to seduction. Remember, silence, well used, isn't absence, it's amplified presence. And perhaps the most sophisticated device of this phase is the use of deliberate ambiguity. When you say something that can have two meanings, one innocent and the other provocative, you activate the other person's imagination without committing to any interpretation. This gives you power, because those who interpret expose themselves, and those who provoke interpretations lead the game. Phrases like, "There are things I only tell by looking someone in the eye," or "I don't know if you could handle this version of me," create emotional tension. They suggest hidden layers. They create an image, and the image holds more captivating than any direct statement. This is the territory of coded language, of phrases that function like keys to invisible doors. They aren't stock phrases like those you see in self-help books. They are your own creations, organic, but always with subtext. The art here is to say little, but leave clues. As if the other person were putting together a puzzle. And when the puzzle seems incomplete, the brain doesn't rest. It wants more pieces. And wanting more is the ideal state for desire to take hold. But there's an essential caveat to this escalation. It must be imperceptible. If the other person realizes you're trying to build value, everything collapses. Subtle value building requires constant calibration. You read the other person's response. Notice the sparkle in their eyes, the change in tone, the increase in the frequency of questions. These are signs that interest has been piqued, and then you can add more. Never all at once. The biggest mistake here is overexposing yourself. It's the equivalent of handing over the instruction manual before the mystery. Desire dies where the enigma is solved. And finally, there's the element that connects all of the above, internal congruence. None of this works if forced. If your internal state isn't consistent with your words, the other person notices. Maybe not rationally, but emotionally. And emotions don't lie. Therefore, the true escalation of value begins within you. It's knowing your worth without needing to prove it. It's trusting that your presence is in itself a gift, and that conversation is a bonus, not a job interview, not a performance, but a game of exchange, and those who know how to play always win, even when it seems like they're not playing. So far, you've created lightness, then you've instilled value. But there's still one element that transforms a simple conversation into a deep emotional bond: mirroring. Not through gestures, nor memorized phrases, but through emotions. Because in the end, people don't connect with what you say, but with how you make them feel about themselves. And if in the early stages the goal was to be perceived as interesting, now the game changes. Here, you become unforgettable. Emotional mirroring begins with a shift in focus. Instead of continuing to seek the other person's attention, you begin to mirror them, showing that you understand, feel, and validate what's being shared, but not like a therapist or an enthusiastic interviewer. Rather, as someone who has experienced similar pains, similar joys, or conflicts that resonate in the depths of human experience. This is the territory where great seducers shine. not by telling remarkable stories, but by awakening forgotten sensations. Science confirms this power. Studies in affective neuroscience reveal that the human brain responds more intensely to emotional connections than to rational stimuli. When someone shares an experience and feels understood on an emotional level, the brain releases oxytocin, the so-called trust hormone. This means that the more you validate feelings, not facts, the closer the other person becomes to you without realizing it. Emotional validation is the invisible glue of intimacy. But be careful. Validation isn't about agreeing. It's about recognizing the emotion behind the words. When someone says, "I hate my job," you might respond with something like, "It's exhausting when we feel trapped in something that no longer inspires us." You didn't engage with the content, you engaged with the feeling. And by doing so, you align yourself internally, not externally. This type of response activates deep mirroring, the kind that makes the other person think, "He understands me." Truly. Ovid once said that love is born when two souls recognize each other through pain and laughter. And this brings us to the second point, using one's own vulnerability as a bridge of connection. Not in the sense of a cheap confession or unnecessary exposure, but as a strategic tool to create resonance. When you share something genuine, an old insecurity, a mistake that transformed you, a memory that still stings a little, you invite the other person to do the same. And in this mutual space, where masks fall and stories intersect, intimacy is born. But not every story connects. To work, it needs to meet 3 criteria. It needs to be specific, emotional, and honest. Specific because the brain responds better to images than to generic ideas. Instead of saying, "I had a difficult childhood," say, "I remember sleeping scared of the sirens because my neighborhood was dangerous." Instead of, "I've suffered for love," say, "I called her on my birthday and she answered with a hello, like she'd completely forgotten who I was." The emotion is in the details, and it's the details that capture your attention. The third mirroring technique is the use of so-called mirror phrases. These are verbal constructions that repeat the emotional structure of what was said, but with a different guise. For example, if someone says, "I feel like I'm not seen at work," you might counter with, "It seems like you're in a silent struggle to prove you're still valuable, and no one notices." This feedback not only shows empathy, it also makes the other person feel revealed. And being revealed is one of the deepest human desires. At this point, you can start using the strategic "we." Phrases that create the illusion of a group, a tribe, a partnership. Something like, "We have this strange way of observing too much before trusting, don't we?" Or, "It seems like we're the type who likes to talk, looking each other in the eye without rushing." The magic of these phrases lies in the subtext. They put you and the other person on the same side of the experience. And when that happens, the brain begins to operate on the logic of belonging. And belonging is irresistible. This type of bond is so powerful that many confuse it with love. And in practice, it is. Because love, before being desire, is recognition. Lacan's famous phrase, "To love is to give what you don't have to someone who doesn't want it," only makes sense when we understand that what we seek is not completeness, but a mirror. The other becomes an extension of our feelings. And if they understand us, we desire ourselves through them. But all power requires care. Emotional mirroring, if misused, can generate instant attachment, especially in needy, emotionally unstable, or those lacking deep validation. Therefore, you need to know how to balance it. Giving too many mirrors can create dependency. The key is to balance moments of depth with lightness and humor. Show that you feel, but that you also know how to laugh at the chaos. That you dive, but come back up. This is reassuring. It shows that you are not an abyss. It is a safe dive. And finally, there is the climax, emotional anchoring. It's when you end a conversation leaving a sense that something there was more than just an exchange of words. It could be with a longer look, a light touch on the arm while laughing at something you shared, or a final phrase that creates a shared image. Something like, "I like those conversations that feel like we've had them before, you know?" That plants a memory. And memories planted with emotion flourish even in absence. Now that you understand the triad of verbal attraction, the soft connection, the insinuated value, and the silent intimacy of mirroring, perhaps the most brutal question is, why hasn't anyone taught you this before? Because deep down, society fears those who master desire. Those who know how to lead a conversation to the point of generating curiosity, tension, and connection without ever asking permission. These people aren't just good conversationalists. They're architects of their own impact. And if you've made it this far, you've already felt this. You've felt that certain words resonate differently, that certain silences say more than long speeches, that there's a code that few know. But that, once activated, changes everything. Your posture changes, your conversations change, your magnetism changes. Because desire, contrary to what they say, isn't born from appearances. It's born from the perception of presence, value, and emotional depth. That's why we created the Forbidden Manual. Not as a manual of empty techniques, but as a portal for those ready to abandon the norm, stop feeling invisible, and step into their own power. It's an audiobook because certain truths need to be heard, not just read, because voice has frequency. And frequency, as you learn today, is what shapes desire even before reason realizes it. If you understand that conversation is much more than exchanging words, it's creating atmospheres, planting images, and leaving emotional traces, then the Forbidden Manual isn't a bonus. It's the next logical step. It's the complete dive. Unfiltered, uncensored, with strategies that wouldn't be allowed in any conventional book. But they work because they speak directly to the brain of desire. And from now on, the choice is yours. Return to the surface, where conversations are noisy and empty, or descend once and for all to where few have the courage to go, the center of human magnetism. Because, as Bataille would say, the true power of seduction is that which disarms while fascinating.